In Dallas, Texas, 3 shots were fired at President Kennedy's motorcade in downtown Dallas. The first reports say that President Kennedy has been seriously wounded by this shooting. From Dallas, Texas, the flash, apparently official, President Kennedy died at 1 p.m. Central Standard Time, 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time, some 38 minutes ago. Vice President Lyndon Johnson has left the hospital in Dallas, but we do not know to where he has proceeded. Presumably, he will be taking the oath of office shortly and become the 36th President of the United States.
Renewed hostile actions against United States ships on the high seas in the Gulf of Tonkin have today required me to order the military forces of the United States to take action in reply.
I have some very sad news for all of you, and I think sad news for all of our fellow citizens and people who love peace all over the world. And that is that Martin Luther King was shot and was killed tonight in Memphis, Tennessee.
Senator Kennedy has been shot. Is that possible? Is that possible? It could. Is it possible, ladies and gentlemen? It is possible. He has. Not only Senator Kennedy. Oh my God. Senator Kennedy has been shot.
Therefore, I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow. Vice President Ford will be sworn in as president.
My fellow Americans, our long national nightmare is over.
Good evening. In California today, President Ford looked down the barrel of a loaded automatic held by a red-haired woman in a long red dress. But the gun didn't go off, and he's all right.
Tonight, President Ford is en route back to Washington, and apparently he will continue his campaign schedule, including a return trip to California in about 2 weeks.
On September 22nd, in another California town, San Francisco, another radical, another gun, the same president. Sarah Jane Moore's motives were confused. Her purpose was not.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
The government of the United States is dominated on many issues much of the time from behind the scenes by what amounts to a clique of bankers, a bankers' cabal, mainly embracing Wall Street, the City of London, the financier faction. You can call them the Anglo-American financier faction. They've been around for a good 400 years. Their crimes are legion.
They hijacked our executive branch in 1976, period of the subject. They have not let go ever since. Every administration has been dominated by these people, and they've used their positions to push forward their agenda of an interdependent world and of a new international economic order. That's it.
The Trilateral Commission, and in particular of Zbigniew Brzezinski. And this is a clique of bankers. They ran the Carter administration. Many people today don't remember how disastrous the Carter administration was, but it was a very, very terrible time, economically as well as strategically. And now this same group has groomed another puppet.
The Trilateral Commission's roots stem from this book, Between Two Ages, written by Zbigniew-Brzezinski in 1970. On page 296, Mr. Brzezinski suggests piecemeal movement toward a, quote, community of nations through a variety of indirect ties and already developing limitations on national sovereignty, end quote. Here we have the same proposal that has been offered by Richard Gardner in the CFR publication Foreign Affairs. Brzezinski then calls for the forging of community links among the United States, Western Europe, and Japan, and the extension of these links to more advanced communist countries. Finally, on page 308 of his 309-page book, he lets us know that what he really wants is, quote, the goal of world government, end quote. Zbigniew-Brzezinski's Between Two Ages was published in 1970 while he was a professor in New York City. What happened, quite simply, is that David Rockefeller read the book. And in 1973, Mr. Rockefeller launched the new Trilateral Commission, whose purposes include linking North America, Western Europe, and Japan, quote, in their economic relations, their political and defense relations, their relations with developing countries, and their relations with communist countries, end quote.
The themes and the patterns in Brzezinski's book very closely mirrored early technocracy. And I don't think it was a mistake that he was at Columbia University at that time.
Technocracy billed itself as a social movement, a philosophy, a scientific solution to political and economic problems, and a new way of ordering the world. But at base, it is an idea for a new international economic order, one to be designed and managed down to the most minute detail by a select few, the technocrats.
Technocracy was defined very succinctly in 1938 by their own publication, the Technocrat magazine. And they call it a system of scientific engineering of, society. They saw themselves as a merger between hard science and social science, which really is an oxymoron. Social science is not really a science, in my opinion. But they really believed that. So they believed that they could take their scientific method that they used in the hard sciences and apply it to society. They also believed that they alone were the only ones that could run society correctly as a result of technology having come in and changed the fabric of society. They hated politicians. They hated the establishment, the organization of society the way it was, because it was not efficient. It was not, conservation-based, if you will, to conserve resources. And so they just kind of took it upon themselves to define an economic model that would replace capitalism and free enterprise. And that's exactly what it was, replacement economic system.
We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other publications whose directors have attended our meetings and restricted their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the bright light of publicity. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march toward a world government.
Watergate is a coup d'etat. Watergate is not what you think. Watergate is not two crusading journalists, Woodward and Bernstein, working for the lovable curmudgeon Ben Bradley of the Washington Post and fighting the establishment and scooping the New York Times and doing all this crazy stuff. Watergate is a coup d'etat. It's quite evil, as you can see from the results, brought about by this same bankers clique with the help of CIA, FBI, Henry Kissinger, and the rest. And Gerald Ford is essentially a bit player, a walk-on part in this. And it reminds us that, simply being president of the United States doesn't really indicate very much that you have special power. You can easily be a puppet, as indeed he was, a puppet of Kissinger. They say, let us make Nixon into a terrible example. Let us destroy him, and let us use that to permanently weaken not just the presidency, because they wanted to weaken the presidency, but let's weaken the Congress too. Let's subject the congressional committee system to a Watergating process, which we can then use to assert more and more financier control over the government. Because I think you can see this aspect in Watergate as it plays out over just a few more years, perhaps, than the mid-'70s. So this is what they do. And the idea with it is something like this. It starts with leaks. Whenever you have leaks, you have to wonder what's going on. Is the overthrow of the president going to be prepared? In the case of Nixon, the leak is the leak of the Pentagon Papers in the summer of 1971, I guess it is, which is essentially a bunch of secrets that are not secrets. Anybody who had been reading Le Monde or any competent European paper knew all this stuff. There was nothing in the Pentagon Papers that was really new. But it was an occasion when the Pentagon Papers were leaked and the New York Times published them and the Boston Globe and the Washington Post and the whole establishment came out to support the leaking of these papers by Daniel Ellsberg, a nuclear targeting planner of the Rand Corporation, not an innocent babe, I'm sure, but rather somebody playing an assigned part. At this point, Kissinger is able to go to Nixon and play on his paranoia, saying to him something like, Mr. President, these leaks are killing us. We can't have a competent government if we've got the leaks of all of these important documents. He says, look, there are all these leaks. We've got to do something about it. We've got to create a special secret police in the White House to fight the leaks. These are the plumbers.
Good evening. We have a mystery story out of Washington. 5 people have been arrested and charged with breaking into the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee in the middle of the night.
The Democratic National Committee is located in the Watergate office building. The burglars forced a stairwell door, then taped its latch open. The door, now part of police evidence, was noticed by one of the guards employed by the Watergate complex. At first, the police found nothing. Then they spied 5 men crouching behind some desks.
Who gets to be a member of the plumbers? Well, the most notorious CIA covert operative of the Cold War, Howard Hunt, the guy who, overthrew the government of Guatemala and committed God knows what other crimes, attempts to kill Castro, possible role in the Kennedy assassination, and so forth and so on. And Gordon Liddy, a member of the FBI, that's the group that is created. And, of course, they go and run wild. They go and break into the Watergate building, the offices of the Democratic National Committee, not once, not twice, but 3 times, 4 times, until they get caught. Because the goal is to get caught and then implicate Nixon in a cover-up.
When I was called in, I forget exactly when, by Magruder, and he said, can you get in the Watergate? And I said, well, yeah, we can probably get in the Watergate, but, why get in the Watergate? And, this was just this wild goose chase as far as I was concerned.
And that's pretty much how it goes. From then on, you get people revealing in the course of hearings that there's a secret White House taping system, the Butterfield revelations. You've got John Dean, another person playing an assigned role, I think, again, not a fighter for democracy and the purity of the Constitution, but somebody who's working for the powers that be. And the powers that be, of course, are not Nixon, but Wall Street, London, people like this. Ellsberg, Dean, all playing their roles. And, of course, Nixon playing his role, too, and manipulated in this paranoia. And the interesting one is the smoking gun tape, the tape which, when revealed in August of 1974, forces Nixon to resign almost immediately. The idea there is that he says there's a group of Texans that have been funneling money illegally to the committee to reelect the president. And he says, well, those Texans will have to testify so and so and so and this, that, and the other thing, and we'll tell the FBI that it's a CIA operation and we'll shut them down this way. The interesting thing here is that the group of Texans that he's referring to includes George H.W. Bush, Bush the elder, Bush the 41st president of the United States. So that is what brings down Nixon. So the idea is it's a complicated process of coup d'etat that takes a couple of years. If Nixon had been smarter, he could have fought back. Now, the relevance of all this to Gerald Ford is simply this. When they talk about the pardon that Ford gave Nixon, right, but people remember, the television is reminding us, oh, Ford was a great guy. He wanted to heal the country. Let's put an end to all of this divisive contention, and let's not drag poor Nixon with phlebitis in front of the magistrates and, have him in the prisoner's dock. He has suffered enough. And then poor Pat and all the rest of this. This is, of course, a lot of malarkey. The issue is that if Nixon had been put with his back to the wall and had to mount a legal defense, the legal defense would most likely have included the fact that there had been a conspiracy to have a coup d'etat against the elected president of the United States, because that is what had happened, quite independent of, the obvious, animus that everybody has against Nixon as a villain and all the rest of it, which I share. But you got to have the clarity of seeing that the main issue is that Nixon is being overthrown by this group. There's a guy in New York City called Woolston Smith, who's a New Zealander, pretty much a British agent, who gives briefings in advance in June of 1972. In the first days of June 1972, he basically goes through a scenario for people saying, hey, there's going to be a bunch of break-ins into the Watergate buildings, and this is going to lead to a crisis that's going to overthrow Nixon. So this is what Ford is essentially doing. He's playing his part in that. So Ford is told by Nelson Rockefeller, the personification of this CIA, Rockefeller, Mellon, Morgan faction that runs much of the country, not all, but a lot, give him a pardon, give him a pardon. And of course he says, yes, sir, and he writes out the pardon, even though with this he's essentially destroying his own political future. Now we get to another interesting one. When Ford becomes president, right, Nixon departs, right, Nixon leaves, it's August of 1974, the vice presidency becomes vacant. There was then a second round of picking a new vice president, because Agnew had been forced out, Ford had been put in. Ford moves up, got to get a new vice president. So at this point, there's a contest. Originally, it's three ways. First of all, it's Nelson Rockefeller for the financiers and the liberal Republicans, Barry Goldwater, and George Bush the Elder is the third candidate. And very early on, Goldwater drops out in favor of Bush the Elder, and it gets to be a fight between Nelson Rockefeller and George Bush to see who's going to be the vice president. So from the point of view of the banking community, this is great, because you've essentially got Chase Manhattan Bank with Rockefeller and Standard Oil competing against Brown Brothers Harriman in the person of Bush the Elder. So it's also interesting to see, if you look in that little chapter, you can see who are the people who wanted Bush to get the vice presidency. Very, very interesting array. Anyway, finally, Ford chooses Nelson Rockefeller, who had been, governor of New York, presidential candidate, famous leader of the financier Republicans, right? Liberal Republican means financier. Liberal means financier, pretty much.
In or out of government, Rockefeller often sponsored conferences on world issues, where he brought together the best minds he could find to develop his wide range of ideas.
Nelson Rockefeller maintained what you might call a shadow cabinet, whether he was in or out of public life. And in the 50s, he was looking for, in effect, his Secretary of State. And he found a then not well-known Harvard history professor named Henry Kissinger.
Soon, these men of vastly different backgrounds became very close friends. Though Rockefeller had only worked for Democratic administrations, he was a Republican. And in 1952, he supported Dwight D. Eisenhower for president. Eisenhower handily won, and Rockefeller became part of his new team. Within 2 years, he was appointed a special assistant to Eisenhower for psychological warfare.
Nelson was appointed to be vice president after Nixon resigned, and Gerald Ford assumed the presidency. And so you had a Beauty and the Beast kind of pairing with an unelected president and an unelected vice president at the same time. More importantly is a question of why Nelson Rockefeller? Why would they want to get him in at that time? This was just after the Trilateral Commission had been founded in 1973. In my view and study of this, the most important thing that Nelson Rockefeller did is that he presided as president of the Senate as vice president. And the Senate in 1974 passed the first iteration of the Trade Promotion Authority Act, the Trade Act of 1974, that set up this so-called fast-track legislation method for trade treaties that would be negotiated by the executive branch, in particular the U.S. Trade Representative, the USTR, as is known. And that legislation got railroaded through by Nelson Rockefeller.
In 1974, he lets Nelson in. In 1975, in a period of 1 month, there are 2 attempts to assassinate poor Jerry Ford, showing how expendable he is. We get Sarah Jane Moore and Lynette Squeaky Fromm. And I believe one or more of these takes place in California, in San Francisco. And the news reports are full of the fact, you know, the bullet holes are still visible in the front of the hotel where this all happened. The problem with this is, though, you have 2 attempts to assassinate the President of the United States in 1 month. Now, the usual theory, of course, is, oh, it's just another one of those lone assassins. But what happens when you have 2 lone assassins? Isn't that somehow a contradiction in terms? I mean, if you had 3 lone assassins, would they still be lone assassins? Looks to me like once you get 2, it's not lone assassins anymore. It's a product, it's a pattern which points to a conspiracy. The Halloween massacre by Ford, so-called, was Halloween, October 31st, 1975. He deprived Kissinger of his 2 hats, right? Kissinger had been Secretary of State and the head of the National Security Council. On that Halloween, Gerald Ford said, no, Henry, you're going to have to be content with Secretary of State. I'm bringing in Brent Scowcroft, later Kissinger's business partner, to be the NSC director. He ousts James Rodney Schlesinger, Rodney the Robot, a kind of Dr. Strangelove of nuclear warfare game theory. He is ousted from the Pentagon. Donald Rumsfeld becomes the Secretary of Defense. All this time, Dick Cheney is the Chief of Staff for Ford in the White House. We also get Colby ousted from the CIA, and George Bush the Elder is brought back from China to be the head of the CIA. Interesting. So George Bush the Elder essentially became Henry Kissinger's secretary, steward, running dog, if you will, in Beijing for the year 1975, and then they bring him back to be the head of the CIA. Ford essentially sponsors the careers of so many of the principal operatives of this invisible government down to our own time. Look at the names we've just mentioned. Cheney is the White House Chief of Staff. Rumsfeld is the Secretary of Defense. Alan Greenspan, who has run the economic side of U.S. life for 15 years or so, is at the Council of Economic Advisors. George Bush is in there. Bremer, who destroyed Iraq, is on Kissinger's staff. And you can make a very long list. The main heavies of the invisible government that we're plagued with until the present time get their big moment, their big chance to make the big career leap under Gerald R. Ford. Now we're in 1976. The banking community says, why don't we get rid of Ford? Let's bring in somebody else who's even more pliable and more adventurous, right? Somebody who's got more, like we say, brinksmanship, somebody who's going to take greater risks. So they find this obscure governor, Jimmy Carter, who has already had at least one nervous breakdown. This is what Carter describes as his born-again experience. But in one of his earlier runs for governor of Georgia, he had lost the election, had a nervous breakdown after that, called that his born-again experience, and was therefore then acceptable to the establishment. Right? They like to have people who've got a certain history of psychological problems.
And it wasn't until Brzezinski came along in 1970 writing his book, Between Two Ages, subtitled America's Role in the Technocratic Era. It wasn't until that book came out that Technocracy, if you will, was reborn.
The man popularly credited with devising the strategy that landed Jimmy Carter in the White House is Hamilton Jordan. A few weeks prior to the November 1976 election, he stated, if, after the inauguration, you find a Cy Vance as Secretary of State or Zbigniew Brzezinski as head of national security, then I would say we failed, and I would quit. You're going to see new faces and new ideas. After the election, Mr. Carter promptly named Cyrus Vance to be his Secretary of State and Zbigniew Brzezinski to be head of national security. Exactly what Mr. Jordan had said would never happen. But the real question is, what is it about Mr. Vance and Mr. Brzezinski that prompted Jordan to make such a statement? And the answer is that these two men are pillars of the very establishment that candidate Carter so often attacked. When Jimmy Carter appointed him to be Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance was a Wall Street lawyer, the chairman of the board of the Rockefeller Foundation, and a veteran of service in the Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations. Zbigniew Brzezinski had taught at Harvard and Columbia universities, served in the State Department during the Johnson administration, and authored numerous books and articles for various establishment publishers and periodicals. David Rockefeller hired Zbigniew Brzezinski away from Columbia University and appointed him to be the director of the Trilateral Commission. Later, in 1973, the little-known former governor of Georgia, Jimmy Carter, was invited to become a founding member of the Trilateral Commission. Mr. Carter was later to say, "Membership on this commission has provided me with a splendid learning opportunity, and many of the members have helped me in my study of foreign affairs." We don't doubt that for a minute. When Jimmy Carter won the nomination for the Democratic Party, he chose CFR member and trilateralist Walter Mondale to be his running mate. Then, the man who told America that he would clean the insiders out chose Cyrus Vance, W. Michael Blumenthal, and Harold Brown for the top 3 cabinet posts. And each of these men is a trilateralist as well as a CFR member. Other trilateralists appointed by Mr. Carter include Zbigniew Brzezinski as National Security Assistant, Andrew Young as Ambassador to the United Nations, Richard N. Gardner as Ambassador to Italy, and several others as top government officials. On March 21, 1978, the New York Times featured an article about Zbigniew Brzezinski's close relationship with the president. In part, it reads, "The two men met for the first time 4 years ago when Mr. Brzezinski was executive director of the Trilateral Commission and had the foresight to ask the then obscure former governor of Georgia to join its distinguished ranks. Their initial teacher-student relationship blossomed during the campaign and appears to have grown closer still. The teacher in this relationship praises Marxism, thinks the United States is obsolete, and is the brains behind a scheme to end the sovereignty of the United States for the purpose of building a world government. And the student is the President of the United States."
So we have in the spring of 1976, I guess it is, or late 75, a meeting of the Trilateral Commission in Kyoto, Japan, where Jimmy Carter, governor of Georgia, little known, is introduced by Gianni Agnelli of Fiat, the Italian automobile company, to this group of international bankers and globalists, saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, here's the next president of the United States. It's going to be Jimmy Carter." Why do they want him? Because Carter is willing to do 2 things. He's willing to turn the government of the United States over to 2 individuals. One is Volcker, who is going to take over the Federal Reserve. He's going to raise interest rates to 22%, the highest since Jesus Christ, as Helmut Schmidt of Germany pointed out. And he's also going to turn foreign policy over to Zbigniew Brzezinski, who is a dangerous adventurer against the Soviets. He's a Polish petty nobleman with British intelligence background through Canada. And that's how we get the disastrous Carter administration. I hasten to point out, I think Carter in the last couple of years has done many, many good and useful things, but we have to hold on also to the fact that the Carter presidency was a disaster and that he was pre-programmed with these people like Volcker and Brzezinski and the Trilateral Commission expressing, a new wave of policy coming out of the banking community.
U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski flew to Pakistan to set about rallying resistance. He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role. On the Afghan border near the Khyber Pass, he urged the soldiers of God to redouble their efforts.
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed. That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
Trilateral Commission is liberal internationalists. Their flavor is indicated by the fact that they pretty much staffed the Carter administration. They were also appalled by the democratizing tendencies of the 60s and thought we have to react to it. They were concerned that there was an excess of democracy developing.
And then you created the Trilateral Commission, in a sense, to develop relationships with Japan and the rest of the world.
I felt very strongly that Japan had become a major power in the world and that we culturally had very few relations with them. It seemed to me that was a mistake. And so I tried first to persuade the Bilderberg group, which you've been to and know, to include Japan. But they turned that down. They thought the relation with Europe was important and stick to it. So when they turned it down, a group of us started the Trilateral Commission.
And it continues today, and you're going to Japan in April.
Exactly.
Although once again David downplays both his role in the Trilateral Commission and its ultimate significance, it is in fact another group of powerful individuals, including multiple members of every American presidential administration since its founding in 1973, meeting in nearly total obscurity to push Rockefeller's globalist agenda.
Well, the Trilateral Commission, as I mentioned, was started in 1973 by David Rockefeller and Zbigniew Brzezinski. And Brzezinski's book, Between Two Ages, I believe is what really brought Rockefeller to the table to, well, at least to pick up Brzezinski as a co-founder of the Trilateral Commission. The subtitle on his book was America's Role in the Technocratic Era. I found out just after I started studying technology that what he meant by the technocratic era was essentially technocracy. It's what we have today. You have to go back and read the book to find that out. But when they got into operation, the first thing they did was to put forth a presidential candidate. That was, of course, remember, they had all the money in the world to put at it, too, with Rockefeller and everybody else around him. They picked up Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale as president and vice presidential candidate, got him elected in 1976, the pair of them. Carter then proceeded to sweep into office 1/3 of the membership of the American members of the Trilateral Commission into his top cabinet positions, and a lot of them went into the State Department too. That was an incredible feat. They wanted to get their hands on the economic machinery of the world, and they did that by capturing the United States executive branch. They didn't care about Congress. They didn't care about the judiciary. They only cared about the engine of economic prosperity, if you will, and that was our government. And so the first U.S. trade representative that was appointed to negotiate trade treaties for the president was a member of the Trilateral Commission. In fact, ever since then, there have been 12 different members or 12 different U.S. TRs that have been appointed by the president along the way. That's over a period of a long time. 9 of those 12 have been members of the Trilateral Commission. What can you say to that other than the fact that, well, it tells you what they were after. They wanted to be in a position to have their man negotiating these treaties like NAFTA and CAFTA and the TPP. The current USTR, Michael Froman, who's putting together the Trans-Pacific Partnership and also the Transatlantic coming right behind it, this guy's a member of the Trilateral Commission. When does this stuff stop?
Do you remember the leaked email that we now have in our possession? You can go and read this email online that was sent from Mike Froman, then an executive at Citigroup, to John Podesta back in October of 2008, October 6th to be precise, or over 1 month before the 2008 Hope and Change selection took place, when millions of earnest Democrats were vehemently arguing, oh, please, oh, you have to get out to the polls next month and vote for Obama, who will be the man who will bring the hope and change that we want, drain the swamp 2008, if you will. And now we know that more than 1 month before that selection took place and Obama was anointed the new president of the American empire, we know that Mike Froman of Citigroup was already writing emails to John Podesta picking Obama's cabinet. And it wasn't just suggestions. These were all of the people who ended up being in Obama's cabinet. He suggested Holder at the Injustice Department. He suggested Napolitano at Fatherland Security. He suggested Rahm Emanuel for Chief of Staff. He suggested Sebelius at HHS. He suggested Shinseki and Arnie Duncan and all of these other people who got in. And, of course, Mike Froman suggested 3 possibilities for Treasury Secretary: 2 Goldman Bankster alumni, Robert Rubin and Larry Summers, who both have intimate relations with Democrat administrations in the past and destroying the whatever semblance remained of the banking industry that led to the 2008 crisis. And the other selection that he offered the incoming administration before it was even voted in was Timothy Geithner. And of course, we know that ultimately the Obama administration appointed Timothy Geithner, the ex-head of the New York Federal Reserve, as Treasury Secretary. So, again, entire cabinet, front to back, top to bottom, picked in advance.
You see, then you have the situation with the World Bank. The president of the World Bank is always appointed by our president. That's how it's set up at Bretton Woods. Europe gets to pick the IMF head, and so they always pick that. But there have been 8 members of the 8 appointees to World Bank since Jimmy Carter. 6 of those have been members of the Trilateral Commission. Now you say, well, what's the big deal with the World Bank? Well, the World Bank has been the major engine of globalization around the world. They had it in their pocket the whole time. You just have to ask the question, okay, they own that position, they own the World Bank, they own the USTR, they own the executive branch, lock, stock, and barrel by and large. Are they looking out after American interests? You know, like just us in America or people in Canada or whatever? I mean, are they looking after our family and even a North American continent? No, they're negotiating for themselves. And what are their goals? Well, they said originally to create a new international economic order.
The Rockefeller fortune, a worldwide network of contacts, the Chase Bank, CFR, Bilderberg, and the Trilateral Commission. If the measure of a man is what he does with power, then it should be remarkably simple to take the measure of David Rockefeller. So what precisely did he do with all this power? This is no great secret. He made no effort whatsoever to hide his aims or intentions, as he himself freely admitted in his 2002 memoirs. Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists, and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will. If that is the charge, I stand guilty, and I am proud of it. Even more secretive and exclusive was the Bilderberg Group, founded in 1954 by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands. Meeting annually, the group has brought together the world's richest and most powerful bankers, corporate heads, government officials, and royalty from Europe and North America for the past half-century. From the beginning, the conference was an incredibly exclusive affair, and one in which the utmost secrecy was demanded from its participants. Only 73 people attended that first meeting in 1954, including Prince Bernhard, several members of parliaments of various European nations, foreign ministers, the former Prime Minister of France, the director of J.P. Morgan, the chairman of Unilever, and other international power players. From within that 73, 10 rapporteurs were selected to introduce the talking points on the agenda and lead group discussion, including, of course, David Rockefeller. Over the 63 years of its existence, the group has hosted discussions that have given birth to the European Union, and, later on, the Euro, planned the 1973 oil crisis, and set the timetable for the 2003 invasion of Iraq, amongst many other things. The group itself has lived in nearly total obscurity for much of that time, guarded from discovery by the publishers and editors of mainstream media organizations that dutifully complied with the meeting's demand for secrecy from attendees. It wasn't until independent internet-based media outlets began covering the meetings in recent years that the group was forced to start an official website, and conference minutes and even recordings of the very first Bilderberg meeting have been leaked online.
You may wonder why I have asked you to come here. I have in mind a completely frank and open exchange of views, and this is ensured to you, and it is essential for our success. There is no verbatim quotation of anybody, and there is no press, so you're quite free to let yourselves go, if I may say so.
It happens over and over again when good information is meticulously researched. They want to put the kibosh on it. They want to, drop that term like conspiracy theory. There was an FBI memo back in '68 when Ed Epstein had written his book about the Warren Commission, and they said, hey, how can we take this down a notch? And they're like, use this term conspiracy theorist. they did something different with you guys. They focused a popular situational comedy, Barney Miller, and they had this up-and-coming actor, Jeffrey Tambor, talk about the Trilateral Commission.
He was in the office of the Trilateral Commission.
Trilateral Commission?
Yeah, the Trilateral Commission.
All right, what is the Trilateral Commission?
It's an organization founded in 1973 by David Rockefeller to bring together business and political leaders from the United States, Europe, Japan, so they could work together for better economic and political cooperation between their nations.
Well, that's what they'd like us to believe. But you see, what they're really up to is a scheme to plant their own loyal members in positions of power in this country, to work to erase national boundaries and create an international community, and in time bring about a one world government with David Rockefeller calling the shots. I take it they're pressing charges?
How accurate is what they put in that script to reality?
It was very, very accurate. They dropped out a few pieces of information. They didn't mention Zbigniew Brzezinski's name as being a co-founder of the Trilateral Commission, but they did mention David Rockefeller, and they lampooned him, so to speak, as being the big global dictator wannabe, bugaboo, whatever. And but by and large, the guy's claims were pretty accurate. And if they were not accurate, there would be no ability to discredit our work, because it was almost like they took some of our work verbatim and put it in this guy's mouth. But it made fun of this guy that was complaining about the Trilateral Commission and just, joked around and says, well, that's ridiculous. It's a, wild tinfoil hat conspiracy-oriented people. Like Hillary Clinton says, the vast right-wing conspiracy. Nothing could be further from the truth, but they always declared themselves to be the moderate middle. The intelligence community in America was completely revamped in 2005 by George W. Bush. He was the guy that signed into law the so-called requirement for the Office of Director of National Intelligence to be implemented. The ODNI would take authority and control over all 17 agencies of the country, intelligence agencies. He received line item budget control over every agency. He was charged with restructuring the agencies to all work together as one. And he was given incredible powers to orchestrate all these changes in our intelligence system. Well, it's interesting that the legislation that was presented to Congress to authorize the president to do this was sponsored by Dianne Feinstein and Jay Rockefeller, both of whom were members of the Trilateral Commission. Interesting. And then George Bush said, that's a great idea, whatever. He didn't veto it. And he established the office of the ODNI, or the DNI, Director of National Intelligence. The first person that he assigned to that super important role was John Negroponte. You can say a lot about John Negroponte in a bad sense, stuff he did in South America, whatever. He's always had a cloud around his head on bad stuff he's done. Pushing all that aside, John Negroponte was a member of the Trilateral Commission. So here you have the law was proposed by members of the Trilateral Commission. The position was filled by a member of the Trilateral Commission. And so when the whole intelligence network of our nation got reorganized, who did it? Who was the one responsible for doing it? A Trilateral Commission member. In other words, did they orchestrate the intelligence community to serve the American people in any way, shape, or form? Or did they do it to serve themselves? And if they did, what was the purpose? We've already established the purpose to create a new international economic order as technocracy. We've already done that. We don't have to lay that groundwork again. But the DNI became singularly responsible for every intelligence agency. In fact, I found documentation that refers to the NSA merely as an agent of the DNI.
Yeah.
that changes everything.
That means
that means the NSA is not a rogue organization. It means it's completely co-opted into the authority of the DNI, who's calling all the shots, who have been members of the Trilateral Commission. You see, they're setting up their monitoring network, is what they're doing for the whole system, not just here but around the world as well. And this is unmistakably a trilateral operation that we have going on right here. And seeing it in that context makes a lot of difference in understanding how close we are to implementing technocracy. And coming from a computer background myself and professionally, as I understand it, what I can tell you is they become very good at collecting information, vacuuming it up from all parts of society. You've got Obamacare, you've got Common Core sucking up information on the kids. You've got all of the other, all the financial records, the co-opting of telephone calls, of emails, all that kind of stuff. It's all going in a master database. They've learned how to collect things very well. All the fusion centers around the country are collecting information. They've learned how to collect it and store it. Then we're in trouble. We're in big trouble. In Miami, just this last week, they're implementing a pre-crime division. Mm-hmm. Think in terms of the movie Minority Report. This is scary stuff. They're not very far away from having the capacity and the algorithms, programs, to analyze the data pretty much in a real-time fashion.
Right.
And when that happens, life is going to change in our country for the worse. And this is an expression of technocracy. It's an expression of the Trilateral Commission hegemony over our country for the last 40 years. So I think a lot of those ideas were picked up by Brzezinski, and now discovering technocracy 40 years later and looking backwards to see how they've implemented it, this is exactly what's been in their mind to do from day one when they originally called it, when the Trilateral Commission called it their new international economic order.
Mr. Speaker, the Trilateral Commission was established in 1973 to foster closer cooperation amongst Japan, Western Europe, and North America. At last week's meeting in Silicon Valley, the focus was on issues such as privacy and security, election interference, and how to strengthen democracy in the world. As a new member, I was honored to spend time among some of the brightest minds in the world, and I look forward to continuing to contribute to this significant entity, helping further democracy both home and abroad.
They were concerned that there was an excess of democracy developing.
Does the European Union need its own army? Will only be listened to, will only be respected, and can only be a military actor in the world if we speak with one voice.
A quantum leader is a new paradigm leader who realizes that the world is holistic. All things, all people, all problems are interconnected. There are no others. There is no separation. I am you, you are me. Thus, a quantum leader would face, say, the problem of inequality very differently, or the problem of identity very differently, because we are not separate, atomistic, isolated individuals.
Well, he's trying to take us forward through the stepping stones of Marxism to arrive at this technotronic era. And I'll say up front, openly, that Brzezinski has been charged with being a Marxist or a communist many times over the years. But if you read his book, you will find out he never was a Marxist. He didn't say that Marxism was a good thing per se, but what he did say is merely a stepping stone, a necessary stepping stone to get to the fourth and final stage of what he calls societal evolution. Remember, he's a political scientist. He talks in weird terms, but he talks about societal evolution has gone through these stages, these maturing process. Marxism was simply just one of those stepping stones, and we had to have it. But we have to get through it. And when we get through it, what we'll end up is with what he described as his technotronic era, and essentially, that would be something very comparable to technocracy that we're talking about, where everything is managed by an elite, where technology is used to do the managing. In that sense, by the way, it's important to differentiate between a personal dictator, like you had Well, even like you had Adolf Hitler, or you had Nero, and in Rome. There were dictators where, if he said off with your head, well, your head was gone. That was just that simple. What the technocratic era does is it creates a system of control, not controlled necessarily by an individual, but the system is the controller of society. And this is what we see, this is what technocracy is all about, applying systems theory to sociological engineering, so that rules and regulations are put in place to be enforced by technology that will keep you in a channel that they want to keep you in. I use the example of go to your bank and try and get more than $300 out of the ATM machine. They just flat out won't do it. It'll tell you your daily limit is $300. And you say, but I've got $100,000 in the bank. I want my money. Oh, sorry, can't get out of this ATM. You could go down the street to another branch of your bank and you put your card in. It knows you drew out the other one. It's going to say, oh, you already taken out your daily limit. Sorry, bub. And if you go inside the bank and ask for the teller just to give you some money, first she'll ask you what you want the money for. You say, it's none of your business. I want my money. If you get past that argument, she'll say, well, we really only have $3,000 in cash in our bank at any one time anymore. And that's true. The banks are not carrying cash anymore for large withdrawals. And so she will say something like, well, we can get the money here, but we'll have to call an armored truck and get it ordered in from another regional bank, and it may take anywhere from 3 days to 2 weeks to get that kind of money here. You say, well, I would really count on getting my money today. I thought I could just draw it out. So, you can't. See, regulations have been put in place that block you from doing stuff like that. And this is what's going to happen in the future in an increasing manner. Another good example I like to use in terms of carbon footprint is that once smart meters are in place and monitoring the power consumption of everybody's home, imagine your carbon footprint in your home being matched to things like, for instance, the no-fly list. Right now, it just consists of terrorists and stuff. People who they say are many people. I remember one time there was a 5-year-old child that was on a no-fly list. I said, how the heck did that happen? Here you have an international group meeting in plenary sessions to hammer out policies, and they vote on the policies that they're going to take back to the respective countries. And then this group from America comes back and implements these policies in our country without any public involvement whatsoever, without the involvement of Congress, and they just do it. It's like, what gives them the right to do this? See, this was a hijacking, literally, of the American government, of the executive branch. But it was not a political coup, even though it involves a political system. You say, why did they want control of the executive branch of the American government? Well, the executive branch was the mover, shaker, and driver of the global economy. Period. We were the superpower. And there was no country that had the influence that we had on global economics and global policy other than the United States. They wanted to get control of that engine of economic process so that they could create their new international economic order. That was their stated purpose. The United States government machinery allowed them to do that. And the evidence now, looking backwards, is so overwhelming on how they did it. For instance, the first USTR was appointed by Jimmy Carter in 1977. There have been 12 USTRs since then. 9 of them have been members of the Trilateral Commission, appointed by the president at the time. 9 out of 12 have been members, including the current one, Michael Froman, who's negotiating the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a member of the Trilateral Commission. Barack Obama appointed Froman. And, you have like the World Bank. There have been 8 bank presidents that appointed by our president of the World Bank. The World Bank is undeniably the engine of global economic transformation. These people have been nefarious, horrible some of the stuff they've done over the decades. But out of 8 World Bank presidents appointed by our president, 6 of them have been members of the Trilateral Commission. Well, how does this come about? You see, it wasn't about political control. It's about economic control. They were going to transform America in the process, but it wasn't about America. It was about the rest of the world. And so you see their influence in things like the USTR, the World Bank, through the intelligence establishment, and so on. Like the National Security Advisor and so on. The NSA, by the way, is a position in government. He's the gatekeeper to the president. Personally, I think it's the second most powerful position in the government, because he's able to limit information as well as give information to the president. So if you have somebody that has an agenda to hide, deceive, or whatever, the NSA is the one that has the ability to do it. And so, we see over a period of time, the NSAs, I think there's been 17 of them since Carter. Out of 17, 10 of them have been members of the Trilateral Commission. They want to control that mechanism. So they've had domination of the economic machinery that's been used to transform the world towards this system of technocracy. The specifications of technocracy included control over energy, much like we have smart grid today, with the smart meters that are going on the sides of homes and businesses all over America, and indeed all over the world. You have the Total Awareness Society today, with all of the breakdown in personal privacy and the roll-up of consumer data, if you will, into massive databases like are being collected by the NSA and others. And we see all of the genesis of these ideas back in the original technocracy documents. I fully expect that the payback for the Rockefeller influence of the United Nations was achieved when the Trilateral Commission turned to the United Nations to use them as a contagion factor for Agenda 21, for sustainable development, for, et cetera, et cetera. And they have been the contagion that spread this to every corner of the planet today. So, was it a good move on their part to start this in the first place? I think they probably knew it was going to be a good thing in the end. They just kept throwing money at it, kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So in the end of it, if you can picture the technocracy world of the future, energy will be controlled so that people must do what they have energy available to do. The resources of the world, where everything is drawn out of, will be licensed to people like you and I through a permit process, where we might be able to scratch out a living on a corner of land somewhere as a farmer. We might be a miner, we might be an oil driller, or whatever, and we may or may not get licenses to do anything. This is essentially like the feudal system in the Dark Ages, where the land barons owned everything and you had to squat on a piece of ground. If the guy liked you, he'd let you stay and farm out, maybe raise some hogs or something, and you give him 80% of what you made, and you get the balance to keep your family alive, if you could. This control over resources is clearly where everything is moving today. This is what sustainable development is all about. Twisting the resources out of the hands of the people and putting it into the hands of the elite. That's the scam in the simplest terms that I can describe. Getting the resources away from you and me and putting it into the hands of a global trust organization. They never say who the trustees are going to be. History tells us exactly who it's going to be. It's going to be the people that set up the system. In other words, whoever implements technocracy is going to be the ones worthy to be the trustees of all the resources of the world.
It is the inventory and control plan. Inventory and control of all land, all water, all minerals, all plants, all animals, all construction, all means of production, all food, all energy, all information, and all human beings in the world. And this is a plan that was agreed to by 179 nations back in 1992. It's a United Nations plan. It's called the Agenda for the 21st Century. And so many of us around the world think that, well, sustainable development, it just sounds so great. Isn't it about recycling and creative reuse and creating energy and food resources for everyone? And the answer is no, it really is not. It's about moving populations into city centers, concentrated city centers, and clearing them out of the rural areas.
Ladies and gentlemen, the origins of the environmental movement as we see it began back in 1968 when the Club of Rome was formed. The Club of Rome has been described as a crisis think tank which specialises in crisis creation. The main purpose of this think tank was to formulate a crisis that would unite the world and condition us to the idea of global solutions to local problems. In a document called The First Global Revolution, authored by Alexander King and Bertrand Schneider, on pages 104 and 105, it stated, "In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine and the like would fit the bill. All these dangers, of course, will be caused by human intervention that will require a global response." That's the origin of global warming, ladies and gentlemen.
So what is the Club of Rome? For those who don't know, you can go to clubofrome.org and you can find on their About section, you can see the Club of Rome is an organization of individuals who share a common concern for the future of humanity and strive to make a difference. Our members are notable scientists, economists, businessmen, high-level civil servants, and former heads of state from around the world. Our mission is to promote understanding of the global challenges facing humanity and to propose solutions through scientific analysis, communication, and advocacy. So, long story short, this is a globalist think tank and staffed with, well, a lot of people who are not household names, some household names, Gorbachev and Joseph Stiglitz and people like that being members or associate members or honorary members or what have you. But this is a think tank that issues reports and publications of that sort. And the most famous or infamous, depending on which side of the line you fall on, was the Limits to Growth, which I believe was published in 1972 and was all about the doom and gloom scaranoia threat of the late 60s, early 70s, the overpopulation, the bomb that Paul Ehrlich and others wrote about, and how it was going to destroy not Western civilization, humanity itself was going to be destroyed by this, and it led to the insane and ridiculous and completely laughably wrong predictions of people like Ehrlich that he gave even odds that the UK wouldn't even exist in the year 2000 because of all of the famines and the like, which were coming down the line, right? And the Club of Rome and the Limits to Growth were very much a part of that hype and threat, and they hyped up their own laughably, provably mistaken, wrong conclusions, predictions, ideas that they thought were coming down the line. And so in that context, of course, they are part of the Agenda 2030 technocracy kind of idea, this idea of sustainable growth, sustainable development, all these things that sound wonderful and warm and fuzzy, but really are about trying to get the vice-like grip over the neck of humanity to squeeze out any of the breath of life that may be left in it so that we don't overpopulate the planet with our evil human cancer. That kind of rhetoric. So, as I say, as far as I know, there's no useless eater money quote, but one that I hope my audience will be familiar with, because I've referenced it numerous times, is the rather startling passage from their 1991 publication, The First Global Revolution, where they wrote, quote, "In searching for a common enemy against whom we can unite, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. In their totality and their interactions, these phenomena do constitute a common threat which must be confronted by everyone together. But in designating these dangers as the enemy, we fall into the trap, which we've already warned readers about, namely mistaking symptoms for causes. All these dangers are caused by human intervention in natural processes, and it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy, then, is humanity itself." End quote. That is insanity. I wish it was insanity. I wish there were not people who truly believed that out there, but there it is in black and white.
Since you are able to edit out all the stuff you don't like, I can speak honestly. So usually speaking, something which happened in the past could happen again, generally. So that could happen, or epidemics. I mean, I don't know what it will be, but in one way or another, we are so far, globally, we are so far above the population and the consumption levels which can be supported by this planet that I know in one way or another it's going to come back down. So I don't hope to avoid that. I hope that it can occur in a civil way, and I mean civil in a special way, peaceful. Peace doesn't mean that everybody's happy. The planet can support something like 1 billion people, maybe 2 billion, depending on how much liberty and how much material consumption you want to have. If you want more liberty and more consumption, you have to have fewer people. And conversely, you can have more people. I mean, we could even have 8 or 9 billion probably if we have a very strong dictatorship, which is smart. But if you had a smart dictatorship and a low standard of living, you can have it. But we want to have freedom and we want to have a high sentence, so we're going to have 1 billion people. And we're now at 7, so we have to get back down. I hope that this can be slow, relatively slow, and that it can be done in a way which is relatively equal, so that people share the experience, but I mean, that's what lies ahead.
That's what lies ahead.
The Club of Rome is considered to be a global think tank, but in actuality it's a group of occultists, dark occultists, that have the absolute intention of bringing about hell on earth. That's the only way I can describe it. Among other things, they deal with the world's economic systems. You see, they have a lot of say in how governments conduct their business economically, and also how policies are shaped by various governments throughout this world. And they also have a lot of power and clout with the international banking cartels, which makes them profoundly powerful. They were founded in 1968 in Rome in Italy, and since July 1st, 2008, the organisation has had its headquarters in Winterthur in Switzerland, which is the same country in which the Bank of International Settlements, the BIS, is based. The principal founder of the Club of Rome was Aurelio Pecci.
Mr. Aurelio Pecci, the founder of the Club of Rome, and somebody whom I consider is one of the first real world citizens. Tell me, Dr. Pecci, why did you decide to come all the way here to Caracas to come to this meeting?
Well, the two topics, social progress and world solidarity, are very important and very near to my interests. World progress, social solidarity, concepts which we should adapt in looking towards the future, as this meeting is concerned with. We talk very much about economic development, technological development, very little of social or human development or progress. And that is the basis of everything, because if the human being, the 4.5 billion people of the world, remain behindhand, lagging behind the other developments, there cannot be any good world. The system will be upset. One day or the other, there will something which give way. Yeah. And we have to talk about the world, because the present system is a world system. Interdependencies are so great, so critical among everything else. Regions among themselves, problems among themselves, solutions among themselves, and with problems. Yes. Everything is interrelated. So we have to talk about the world much more than nation
Yes.
or continent.
Yes. There was a panel this morning on the whole question of urbanization, and you were making some very interesting observations about how mankind has become too arrogant and forget their place in nature.
During World War II, Pecci became involved in the then existing anti-fascist movement, which was primarily communist. In fact, Pecci himself admitted to the fact that he held communist ideals. Very few people ever mention that the founder of the Club of Rome was an out-and-out communist. It's just something interesting, isn't it? Pecci also threw his energies into ADELA, that is the Atlantic Development of Latin America organization. This was an international consortium of bankers who were looking at industrializing Latin America. If you take a look at the mess that has erupted in Latin America, you can actually trace all these problems back to ADELA, the Atlantic Development of Latin America organization, these bankers and what they came up with. And they threw their support behind Pecci and consequently behind the Club of Rome. That should tell you something. You should be very worried by that. Incidentally, as an aside, what you'll frequently notice is that these international banking cartels are designed to work hand in hand with communism to destroy Western civilization, right? These links between communism and international banking go back decades. It's not a new thing. Pecci was asked to give the keynote speech for ADELA in Spanish at the group's first meeting in 1965, which directly led to the creation of the Club of Rome, because Pecci's speech caught the attention of Dean Rusk, who was then American Secretary of State. Why is this important, you might wonder? Well, because I've spoken previously about how the United States of America and its Department of State, the State Department, was very heavily infiltrated by Soviet communist spies. To give concrete examples of this, Alger Hiss, who went on to basically create the United Nations for all intents and purposes. Right? The United Nations is not an innocuous organization. It's actually profoundly dangerous and, I would say, malevolent in what it wants to accomplish. But Alger Hiss was instrumental in that. He, of course, later admitted to being a communist. The same thing is true of another chap that was in the State Department by the name of Henry Dexter White. I've spoken about both these gentlemen before, but if you're new to my work, then you need to check these people out. Because Henry Dexter White essentially created the International Monetary Fund, the IMF, and the World Bank, which are overseen by the Bank of International Settlements. Okay? So these banking cartels were created by the communists. I mean, you couldn't make this stuff up. It's genuinely true. All you need to do is look into it a little bit and you'll see that. So Dean Rusk, the then American Secretary of State, had Pecci's speech translated into English and distributed at various meetings in Washington. In February 1974 in Salzburg in Austria, Pecci persuaded Austrian Chancellor Bruno Kreisky to host a meeting. Besides Bruno Kreisky, the following heads of state of government were also present: Leopold Senghor, the President of Senegal; Luis Echevarria, the President of Mexico; Joop den Uyl, the Prime Minister of the Netherlands; Olaf Palme, the Prime Minister of Sweden; Pierre Trudeau, the Prime Minister of Canada, and the representatives of the Prime Ministers of Algeria and Ireland. The nature and contents of the meeting have never been disclosed, and to encourage the participants to speak freely, they were asked to come without accompanying civil servants, and they were assured that nothing they said would be attributed to them. The interesting thing there is that Pierre Trudeau, of course, the Prime Minister of Canada, followed the dictates of the Club of Rome. And his son, Justin Trudeau, is the current Prime Minister of Canada, and he has shifted the political paradigm in Canada far to the left. We're talking radical left territory. We're talking violent radical left territory. We're talking the destruction of Canada. And a lot of people in the West who are socialists, who are communists, are doing exactly the same thing.
Before looking at the more general aspects of governance, let me just make 2 points with regard to the US election. And one is that Hillary apparently won the vote among the public. She had slightly more votes than Trump, yet he got more electoral votes. So one obvious change that should be considered is to abolish or to change the system of the electoral college. It seems to be totally outdated.
The Club of Rome. Could we have the slides, please? The Club of Rome, I would like to go back really into the Club of Rome and take you to 1768. 200 years before the Club of Rome was founded, the Lunar Society of Birmingham was founded. And the Lunar Society of Birmingham had some 3 incredible members. That included William Small, who was no one else less than the tutor of Thomas Jefferson. That included Erasmus Darwin, who was, of course, the grandfather of Charles Darwin, but he was a very well-known poet and a medic. And it included Matthew Boulton, who actually was the partner, the financier of Mr. Watt, Thomas Watt. And they got together on the Monday closest to full moon. Because when it was full moon, they could walk home after dinner using the light of the moon. And they were considered so strange by society that today we still call these kind of people lunatics. So the word lunatics comes from this club of 3 who started gathering about 40 people together. And these 3 people were at the nexus of the American independence by tutoring Thomas Jefferson, the French Revolution, and the Industrial Revolution. 200 years later, exactly 200 years later, in 1968, there are 3 men getting together again. Watch out for the next meeting, in 2168. But what is very important is, and I'm insisting, having been so privileged to be with Aurelio during 6 years of his life, that Aurelio's mind of bringing people together, and we can't go through the whole history, the time doesn't allow with me, but the meeting with Alexander King on one hand, who was a bureaucrat, who had served at the embassy of the United States, of the embassy of England with the United Kingdom in the United States during the war, and German Gvisciani, who had learned to know in the negotiations for the creation of the first large foreign car manufacturing in the Soviet Union. Don't ever forget, please, German Gvisciani, because without him the club would not have happened. And I know we kind of like to forget the Soviet Union and the USSR, but he was very instrumental in creating bridges. In 1968, the club decided it was going to do, and I quote, "study the predicament of humanity in complex and an uncertain world." And the statutes of the Club of Rome state that they will examine long-term impact of accelerating change. It was a catalyst for frontier ideas. The club didn't care if there was a scientific reference, if there was a footnote. Is the idea potentially a catalyst? Then we would go for it. The man behind it is Aurelio. I mean, anyone who had the privilege and the pleasure of spending time with him was captivated by and the charm and the intellect and the capacity to enroll and enlist people. But mind you, his PhD was out about the first 5-year plan of Lenin. Let me just give you a little bit of context. And he was the deputy manager of the first warplane factory of a consortium of Italian companies with the support of Mussolini, of course, in China. For Aurelio, it became a bit difficult in Italy with his positions, and of course his extraordinary intelligence and capacity to get things done made him not so welcome somewhere. Pietro Savoretti became his front man in the Soviet Union. Germin Gvisciani got him going, and here is the first real impact of the club. In parallel to the creation of the club, Aurelio and Germin Gvisciani were very busy with Lord Zuckerman and George Bundy in order to create IASA. I don't have to tell you what IASA is. But it was so key to know that even before the club started, those negotiations were already ongoing. The East-West Center for New Initiatives, based in Vienna, was a platform that permitted to channel ideas between East and West in the Cold War. It was funded by the Fiat family. The Accademia dei Lincei, the meeting that was organized in '68, was also funded by the family Agnelli. We should know that there is a deep relation between Aurelio. Indira Gandhi became so excited about it. She wanted to meet Aurelio. Of course, Her Majesty the Queen Beatrix and her mother Juliana all got so keen, and they thought it was about time the Dutch got more involved in the content. So when Jan Tinbergen got the first Nobel Prize, he immediately got a budget to write a report to the Club of Rome about reshaping the international order. And there was this incredible Austrian Chancellor, Bruno Kreisky, who, I would say, if it wasn't love, it was definitely very platonic, but Aurelio and Bruno, they liked each other. And whatever Aurelio had in his mind, Bruno would do it. And I can tell you that this meeting, which is probably one of the most prominent meetings the Club of Rome did, was bringing together 9 heads of state in Salzburg to debate. Exactly as you were saying, Sandrine, let's bring together these cities. Well, Aurelio was bringing together the heads of state. Of course, he needed to have someone to pay the bill. And Bruno Kreisky paid the bill. But Bruno Kreisky's budget was not good enough for that because it was in Salzburg. So the governor of Salzburg, Hasselauer, footed the other half of the bill. And ladies and gentlemen, being in Rome and in the Vatican, I must speak about Cardinal Franz König. Aurelio always stated that he was agnostic, and the Club of Rome was not going to get into religion. But I have been witness of meetings organized in Vienna, again with the help of Bruno, whereby the cardinals of the Vatican were meeting with the Communist Party of the Soviet Union.
This reshaping of the international order is analogous with the New World Order. Now, a lot of people don't understand this point, by the way, that the New World Order is very, very real. It is not a myth. Okay, I'm stating that as a fact. I'm telling you this. Now, you can read the published works of the people responsible for the creation of socialism, for the creation of communism, and you will see, and I've talked about this before, you will see that they distinctly mention creating a new world order. So people need to snap out of this nonsense of, oh, it's just a conspiracy theory. It's not. It's a reality. It's being done right around you right now. After numerous working sessions and presentations over an 18-month period, the final results of Rio, that is the reshaping the international order, were presented at a meeting in Algiers in October 1976 and accepted by the Club of Rome. The last meeting Pecci organised and participated in was in Bogota in Colombia between the 15th and 17th of December 1983. Again, the contents of that meeting were never disclosed. But at that meeting was not only Pecci but the President of Colombia, Belisario Betancourt. Pecci died on the 14th of March 1984 in Rome. In 1991, the club published the following paper called The First Global Revolution. This is very important. Let me repeat that so that you can read it for yourself. The First Global Revolution. It was published in 1991 by the Club of Rome. It purportedly analyzes the problems of humanity. But what's interesting about it is that it actually calls human beings, in essence, problematic. That is according to the Club of Rome. They view humanity as their enemy. Now, that's a genocidal position to hold, of course. Right? It genuinely is. It's insane. Right? It's what leads to mass murder, and you'll see what I'm getting at as we go on with this. The club also stated in another publication called Goals for Mankind that the ideal sustainable population is hence more than 500 million, but less than 1 billion. That's according to the Club of Rome. What's disturbing about that is that the current population is approximately 7.2 billion. How do you get it to just over 500 million? They may well, in fact, be responsible, because they were talking about the creation of these real and unreal enemies. They may well be responsible for international terrorism through their machinations. Because what they're fundamentally talking about, I mean, reread this, right, and you'll see this. What they're talking about is social engineering, changing attitudes and behaviors of human beings. I mean, that is social engineering. But they'll use these buzzwords like sustainable development, which are a part of a persuasion system designed to render innocuous the true horror of the UN's Agenda 21. This is not conjecture, this is fact. All you need to do is read the papers that they've published. Okay? Just read the reports published by these institutions and these think tanks, and you'll see what the heck I've been talking about. You will see it is absolutely true.
That for the first time in human history, for the first time in all of human history, almost all of mankind is politically awake. And these new and old major powers face still yet another novel reality, in some respects unprecedented. And it is that while the lethality of their power is greater than ever, their capacity to impose control over the politically awakened masses of the world is at a historical low. I once put it rather pungently, and I was flattered that the British Foreign Secretary repeated this, as follows. Namely, in earlier times, it was easier to control 1 million people, literally. It was easier to control 1 million people than physically to kill 1 million people. Today, it is infinitely easier to kill 1 million people than to control 1 million people.
This time with more preparation, more indoctrination. So this is the moment where this clique of bankers decides to bring in a new face. And this time, not a right-winger, not a neocon, but a left-wing demagogue who promises hope and change, but actually represents policies that are qualitatively worse, qualitatively more destructive, and he can deliver Europe as pawns in order to let the US, British world domination go on for another 100 years. Now that's the project. That's more ambitious than any neocon, and it's more adventurous, and it's more dangerous. So people in Europe had better wake up that silly romantic illusion they have about Obama is going to be suicidal for them if they don't understand this. He is a puppet of finance capital of the worst possible circles, of David Rockefeller, George Soros, and this group. And their project is extreme austerity, savage reductions in the standard of living, and the basically immiseration and impoverishment of the United States. In terms of foreign policy, it is this plan to have a global showdown with Russia and China. So for that, they need left cover. Now, there's also an angle for Europe, though. The idea, of course, is that with Bush or McCain, the U.S. is disliked, the policy is discredited, nobody wants to go along with this. The demagogy of Obama is that with this new face, somehow you can now get throngs and throngs of young dupes and individuals who have really no clue what they're doing to support this stuff. In other words, Obama wants Europe as a tool against Russia. And I would urge you, don't go there. Realize that that is what you're being offered,
and don't do it. And if Obama comes from London to Paris to Berlin, it would be important for people to go out there and say, well, or not to go out there, say, we don't want any part of this. This is the policy that Brzezinski's been following. NATO expansion, far beyond the lines that were agreed on back in 1990 and 1991.
Do you have any interest in running for president?
This is where Tony Blair attended, Macron, Bill Clinton attended before they became into high positions of power. So we're wondering, what was your motive for even coming here?
I've got no comment.
No motive on why you're here, even as an elected official of the United States?
I came to try and learn.
Join me, and we'll repair the damage done to our country and be stronger than ever.
American musician and DJ Moby claims he's been doing the behind-the-scenes bidding of anti-Donald Trump figures. In a recent interview, he said friends and contacts within the CIA had asked him to promote certain ideas online, including the alleged collusion between the president and Russia. And the reason for that, because Moby has a more significant presence on social media.
I've managed to make a few friends in the intelligence community. So they passed on some information to me and they said, like, look, you have more of a social media following than any of us do. Can you please post some of these things just in a way to sort of put it out there?
When do we see almost a shadow government come out and say, we cannot side with the government, whether it's the cabinet or the Senate? I think that's the big question.
First of all, I think it's the obligation of some executive branch officials to refuse to carry out some of these orders.
And he's entitled to briefings from the CIA, for example. I said publicly, give him fake briefings. Pretend you're briefing. Don't tell him anything that you don't want to get out.
The president reacting to the New York Times op-ed from an anonymous, what they call a senior administration, Trump administration official, where it is titled, I am part of the resistance inside the Trump administration. I work for the president. With like-minded colleagues, I have vowed to thwart parts of his agenda and his worst inclinations.
That's right, Paul. It all started early Saturday. President Trump taking to Twitter and leveling a dangerous accusation against his predecessor, President Barack Obama, alleging without any evidence that the Obama administration wiretapped Trump Tower during the campaign.
We have major breaking news right now. The U.S. Justice Department has just named a special counsel in the Russia investigation.
Take on the intelligence community, they have 6 ways from Sunday of getting back at you.
Top intelligence officials provided information to President-elect Donald Trump about claims of Russian efforts to compromise President-elect Trump.
Okay, I will say this, because it's a message I've got from people from the CIA. I know a lot of officers, I know a lot of agents. I've been in their homes, and they're really delivering this to you and to Donald Trump.
The FBI used to spy on the Russians. This time they spied on us.
I'm starting to have concerns about you, Bert.
Right now,
tell me what the secret message from the CIA is.
They tried to frame incoming president with a false Russian conspiracy. It never existed, and they knew it. They plotted to ruin him as a candidate and then destroy him as the president.
you're attacking us, can you give us a question?
Go ahead.
No, Mr. President-elect.
Go ahead.
Mr. President-elect,
Go ahead.
Since you are attacking
No,
our news
not you.
organization,
Not you.
Can you give us a chance?
Your organization
you
is
are attacking
terrible.
our news organization.
Your organization
Can you give
is
us a
terrible.
chance
Let's
to
go.
ask a question, sir?
Go ahead.
Sir,
Quiet.
can you
Quiet.
Mr. President-elect.
Go ahead.
She's
She's asking a question. Don't be rude.
President-elect, can you give us a question?
Don't be
You're
rude.
attacking us. Can you give us a question?
Don't be rude.
Can you
No, I'm
give
not
us a
going to give you a
question?
question. I'm not going to give you a question.
Can you state
You are
categorically-
fake news.
Sir,